Welcome to Givers, Doers, and Thinkers. Today we talk to sociologist Brad Wilcox about how, for better or worse, civil society affects our marriages and families, and vice versa. Let's go. Givers, Doers, and Thinkers introduces listeners to the fascinating people and important ideas at the heart of American civil society. We speak with philanthropists, nonprofit leaders, social entrepreneurs, historians, journalists, and anyone else who will help us understand contemporary civil society's achievements and failures. We also sprinkle in practical advice for nonprofit leaders and fundraisers. My name is Jeremy Beer, and thanks for joining us. All right. Thank you for joining us once again on Givers, Doers, and Thinkers. We are recording this podcast on December 2nd, 2020, which I say not only to give you, the listener, some helpful context, but also for the benefit of those future historians who will no doubt be studying us. Today, we are very fortunate to have with us my friend Brad Wilcox. Professor Wilcox is the director of the National Marriage Project at the University of Virginia, professor of sociology at the University of Virginia, senior fellow at the Institute for Family Studies, and a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Brad, it is not too much to say, is one of the leading, if not the leading, marriage and family scholar in the United States. He is the author of Soulmates, Religion, Sex, Love, and Marriage Among African Americans and Latinos. He has a habit of asking questions we'll probably have to stop and do it again. I think we're getting some feedback there. Maybe Brad from something was scraping. So
you can just keep rolling with it and she'll cut this.
Okay. I'll start back in. He is the author of Soulmates, Religion, Sex, Love, and Marriage Among African Americans and Latinos. He has a habit of asking questions that people don't seem to like to ask, let alone answer, and his work has extraordinary relevance for anyone interested in the well-being and flourishing of American civil society. Brad, how are you doing?
Doing great, Jeremy. Thanks for having me here today.
It's great to have you here, my friend. And we have a lot to talk about. Obviously, there's a lot going on in the world today. It's December 2nd, 2020. That has relevance to questions of marriage and family. And so that's where I want to start, just with the present crisis, if you don't mind. What research do we have at this point on how the pandemic and our social and governmental reactions to the pandemic are affecting marriage and family life? Do we have some good data yet?
Yeah, Jeremy, we do have some actually good data. At the beginning of the pandemic, there were plenty of media stories that were predicting that a lot of marriages would break under the strain of COVID lockdowns and surging unemployment and couples struggling to homeschool their kids. And we certainly do see in the data that about a third of married couples, have been really struggling in the last year in the wake of everything that's happened. So there's certainly some groups of husbands and wives who would kind of fit that crisis narrative. But what we also see in the research is that a majority of husbands and wives are reporting more appreciation for their spouse and a deeper sense of commitment, for their spouse. And that sort of strengthening impulse or trend, I think, swamps the more corrosive trends that we'd see related to COVID. So on net, what we're predicting is that there'll be a marked decline in divorce this year in 2020 compared to 2019. And there may be a bit of an uptick next year in divorce as kind of pent up, interest in divorce is expressed. But I would predict that as you kind of look forward over the next decade or so, we'll see divorce come down, overall. As I think the fallout of all of this economic and medical and social pandemonium makes people, I think, more cautious about family life. And that would mean also cautious about getting divorced. And also, as I sort of intimated, I think more likely to turn towards their spouse, looking for support rather than to seek an exit from the marriage. So that's sort of the good news, I would say, about COVID's consequences. I mean, I think we're going to see among those who are married a kind of continuing move away from the kind of more soulmate-y, more individualistic ideas about marriage that took hold in the 70s in the United States towards what I call a family first model, where you kind of recognize how much you, your kids, your spouse all depend upon one another for emotional, social, and economic support, and act accordingly. So again, that's the good news. The bad news, I think, is that the sort of economic and social dislocations we've been seeing play out are going to make young adults even more hesitant about tying the knot, about getting married. And so we're going to see, from my estimations, about a third of today's younger adults, folks who are in their 20s, will end up never marrying. And that's going to be really pretty exceptional in our history, and I think it's going to pose a lot of problems for both those many of those men and women who will never marry, and then also it'll pose problems for the country as a whole, because in general, on average, marriage provides people with an important sense of meaning, purpose, direction, stability, and solidarity that you can't kind of replace in mass.
Okay, let's. I want to unpack. There's a lot that you just told us there, and some of it is surprising. And what I want to ask you is, does it surprise you that marriages aren't, or don't seem to be, cracking under the strain of the additional stress, the additional time spent together, the
Sure.
economic stress, all that stuff? Does that surprise you?
It doesn't surprise me because, we saw a kind of similar dynamic play out in the last Great Recession, about a decade ago, where divorce came down in the midst of the recession, then went up a little bit and then came down again. And we had reports at that time of, a majority of couples in the midst of all the economic turmoil of the Great Recession reporting that they were, that they had a kind of greater commitment towards one another. And so that's, I think, again, in the face of this sort of these crises, people often will, sort of band together, including in their own marriages. The other thing that I would say, though, too, is that one of the, I think, concerning parts of this whole story is that because marriage has become much more selective in recent years, and what I mean by that is that marriage is more of the province of the well-educated, the affluent, and also the religious. And of course, that last point is not often recognized in our public conversation, but it's certainly true. So I think the kinds of people who've been sort of heading into this pandemic who are married often have things going for them, be they economic things or religious things that kind of lend additional strength and stability to their marriage.
Marriage is now a middle and upper middle class good in some way.
Right, or a religious good, yeah. So
or a religious good, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Very interesting. So do we know whether talk about those? You say 1/3 of marriages are struggling. At least that's what the data show in this time. Do we know what distinguishes, what characteristics those marriages have that the others don't? Are those less religious marriages? Are those poorer couples?
Yeah. So what we've seen so far in terms of understanding those couples is they are more likely to come from the ranks of people who've been struggling economically, not surprisingly, where there's been a job loss, for instance. They're also in situations where oftentimes one spouse is more conservative, one spouse is more liberal. Typically, the husband's more conservative, the wife's more liberal. And I think they've had disagreements about Donald Trump. They've had disagreements about how best to respond to the pandemic. And that, is cause for friction in their marriages. And then I think couples, where they've both been heading into the pandemic working full time with kids at home, and they're struggling to kind of find a new rhythm, a new routine. And most of the time, mom takes over as the primary homeschooler. But I think there's kind of a role overload for a lot of these moms, and understandable resentment at times too, that oftentimes they're doing more than their husbands are. Of course, what's interesting too there is we're not seeing the same dynamics playing out for couples where mom is working part-time, or especially where mom is a stay-at-home mom. So, there are these differences, that sort of basically lead different kinds of couples to be more or less stressed out by the lockdowns and everything else.
Brad, is there any data you everything you say raises like 5 more great questions in my mind, which is why I'm glad you do what you do, because you actually have answers to these questions or most of them. Is there any evidence that political differences in a marriage, political affiliation differences or ideological differences are cause more friction now than they did a generation ago or so?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question in terms of the time change. I do know from work done by Wendy Wang here at the Institute for Family Studies, and we posted this on our blog, Family Studies, is that couples who have political differences are more likely to be struggling, more likely to be unsatisfied with their family situation. Whereas couples who share the same political affiliation today are more likely to be happily married. And it's particularly true for Republicans. So, but what I can't tell you is sort of how much that's changed. Now, I would certainly hypothesize that given the increasing political polarization that we're seeing in recent years, that probably this political dynamic is more salient, in 2020 than it would have been, in 1990 or some other earlier period of time.
Yeah, that would be my hypothesis too. And I look forward to seeing that research that you will no doubt now commission, right? And do. I mean, we probably have data on political affiliation in marriages, right? Going back that we can look at.
We certainly have data on political affiliation in marriage. I don't know if there's good dyadic data that we could use to sort of compare trends over time, but that's the question, but yeah, we certainly have info on people's affiliations and their marital happiness. Yeah.
So you went very quickly past a particular distinction that I want to just pause and draw out for listeners, because I'm sure that many of them have not thought about this like you have in marriage models. There's one model you call the soulmate model. There's another one you call the family first model. So can you talk about what the differences are between those models and how they've our gravitation toward those models has changed over time?
Yeah, my sort of sense of the matter is that, in the late 60s and 70s, a lot of, Americans who were marrying kind of took a more soulmate view of marriage. They came to see marriage as a vehicle for, expressing their own identity, for being, for making them fulfilled and happy. And they were less likely to think about it in terms of, marriage, in terms of duties and obligations and whatnot, both towards one's spouse and towards one's children. And so I kind of would broadly describe this as kind of the rise of a soulmate model in the 70s. And not surprisingly, that, that approach where you kind of see marriage as a vehicle for your own personal happiness, fulfillment, satisfaction, and place too where you can kind of do your own thing to an important extent, was not particularly conducive towards marital stability. So we see a huge surge in divorce in the 70s. But I think, since the 1980s, when the divorce rates come down in America, I think a lot of Americans have become, for either principled or prudential reasons, more family-centered. I think more cognizant of the ways in which, their own financial well-being long-term, the health of your 401k or, your investment in a home, for instance, and the welfare of your kids. I mean, their capacity to flourish, their capacity to attend and graduate from college, their capacity to launch into young adulthood successfully, all depend in some ways on your capacity to kind of keep it all together. And so we do see, that married families since the 1980s have become more stable, which is obviously good news. And again, I think that what's happening here is there's sort of a recognition that, marriage does, advance a whole bunch of different goods for people and kids. And so they've kind of people have become more, I think, cautious about marriage and less likely to head for a divorce court when they experience some kind of difficulty. And I would further hypothesize that, all the tumult that we're seeing right now with COVID and our political polarization, protests, unrest, et cetera, at some level, I think will make people more likely, once they've gotten married, to stay married. There's sort of, I think, an implicit recognition that when times are tough, it's best to have a kinship network, that can support you. So another kind of way to think about this is that there's a very smart psychologist named Eli Finkel, And he has written a book called The All or Nothing Marriage. And he's kind of more of this view that marriage has become this kind of like incredible vehicle for self-realization. He's not sort of arguing that in kind of a simplistic way. I mean, he would certainly acknowledge that some people can kind of pursue that project by being good spouses and good parents. But he does kind of think that, because of the ways in which we are relatively more affluent and that we're relatively more secure, in our modern world, that people don't have to kind of look at marriage as much as sort of an institution that protects their kids and their finances and their sort of social welfare more generally. And he's also drawing upon, a famous psychologist and called Maslow, and sort of talking about how people kind of move up. I mean, as a psychologist, how people kind of when things are more secure in their lives and their societies, they can kind of focus more on themselves, basically. And he thinks that whole idea applies to marriage, right? And so we're at kind of this peak moment where people are freer and freer to have these like incredible marriages where you get to do your thing, your spouse gets to do her thing, and everyone can kind of enjoy these incredible opportunities for personal growth and fulfillment, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, I'm skeptical of his theory here, and I think what he doesn't appreciate is how much, at some level, a lot of people today, particularly people who are better educated, they can see the handwriting on the wall, for themselves and their kids. They recognize that we're entering a new era of tremendous economic inequality, I think economic instability, real competition, between our kids for resources when it comes to schools and jobs and whatnot, colleges. And so I actually think that the social environment has changed in fundamental ways that will encourage people to kind of move down the mountain, move down Maslow's mountain, if you will, to use that metaphor again, and see marriage and kin as resources to help oneself and one's kids navigate an economic and social world that's less secure, less stable, and makes, I think, at least people who are kind of prudent, makes people kind of, more inclined to see their marriage as serving many, many different kinds of goods, not just sort of their own individual fulfillment.
Yeah, as you say, you think people are reading the writing on the wall. And by the way, that soulmate model I'm always struck watching old sitcoms with my wife or something at night, like an old Mary Tyler Moore or a Newhart or something like that. There's always somebody leaving a perfectly good marriage to just go find themselves, because they want to be an artist or something,
right.
And it's like, it is striking how that's kind of gone now. Like that's gone, at least from our actual lives for the most part. People aren't just leaving basically perfectly good marriages because their spouse is a little bit boring,
Right.
That has changed.
And just as a quick note here, I mean, this is obviously this movie Marriage Story that was, released to much critical acclaim on Netflix in 2019, starring Scarlett Johansson and Adam Driver, about this couple who have basically, there's nothing really wrong with their marriage. They've got a son and, but they've got some tensions in terms of where they're going to work and, all this kind of stuff. And so they end up getting divorced for no real reason. And I think that movie is just, it's so emblematic of a kind of older mindset that's no longer relevant,
Yeah, that just doesn't, like you were saying, that's really not at all representative of how most people actually treat their marriages now. But here's the question then: if marriage confers all these goods, people can read their handwriting on the wall in this period of more instability, et cetera, and yet people aren't marrying as much. You would think people would be flocking towards this good. What's going on there? Why this barrier to marriage?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think the answer to your question is, there's sort of multiple ways to answer your question. I mean, I think part of the story here is that economically, men have not done as well in recent years, particularly men who don't have college degrees, who still make a majority of guys. And so, both, I think, in their own eyes and the eyes of potential partners, they're not necessarily marriageable or as attractive as marriageable men. I think that's part of the story. I think there is also this idea out there that work and sort of fun are the things to pursue, particularly in your 20s. And it's sort of like an odyssey decade, basically, in the minds of, I think, too many young adults. And that, marriage is not really a key priority until you hit like age 30 or close to 30. And of course, by then, your options will often have narrowed. You may not be able to find someone who really kind of is a good match for you. I think that's part of the cultural story. And I think there's a way in which, too, still, I think on the front end, before people are married, too many young adults do have kind of a soulmate or a storybook idea of marriage. And so, their expectations of what a spouse, should be are too high. Lori Gottlieb had a funny article in The Atlantic and then a book of the same name called Marry Him. And she begins the book by listing like more than 100 different traits that she was looking for in a spouse, and sort of lamenting that her kind of high expectations for marriage had put her in a position where she didn't get married, had a kid on her own, and then found herself on Saturday mornings, tending her child in the park and seeing all of her friends' husbands, there at the park, tending their own kids. And she sort of had this, this revelation that, had she been less picky about a spouse, she'd probably be having coffee with her girlfriends and letting the father and the husband take care of the kid at the park. So there's a lot more one could say about why marriage, but I think an overly romanticized view of marriage is part of it. I think, and also a romanticized view of work is part of the problem, and then some economic challenges for working class and poor men. And then I guess finally, the other thing I would just add to all of that is just I think there is a lot of confusion about relationships, commitment, trust, and we've kind of deinstitutionalized that whole kind of phase of life, sort of dating phase of life that would lead to marriage in many civilizations, and so young adults don't have like an easy roadmap from.
There's not a ladder, a map,
exactly.
a path that you just automatically follow. You have to figure it out on your own with the help of capitalism via dating apps.
Correct, and there are tons of poor. Of shows and songs and movies that give you all the wrong messages about how to navigate all this.
Well, hey, that's Brad. We will be right back with Brad Wilcox. We're gonna change the conversation a little bit and talk about marriage and civil society. We'll be right back. Okay, time for a little practical advice. With us right now is Scott Bucko, managing consultant here at American Philanthropic. How are you doing today, Scott?
I'm doing well, Jeremy.
Scott, you do a lot of work on capital campaigns for us here at AmPhil. This comes up a lot with a number of our clients or prospective clients. And one question that's always asked is, how do we know if we're ready for a capital campaign? Like what sort of internal boxes do we need to check or think about when we're considering whether we want to do or ought to do a capital campaign? Well, what's your answer to that?
Yeah, great question. And the way I approach that question and helping an organization think about whether they're ready for a capital campaign is by asking them, or sharing with them that a capital campaign is going to be successful if it has four key elements in place. And it starts with a compelling case for support, the whole reason why you want to conduct a capital campaign.
Which is harder, by the way, than it sounds, right? People often think they have a compelling case for support when they have nothing yet of the kind.
Exactly, right. It's just a dream, a vision, but they need to ask seriously whether it's going to be compelling and also practically feasible. So, for an organization of their size, whether they're large or small. The next key element is leadership. So, does it have? Does the organization have leaders with the will to conduct a capital campaign? And by will, I mean being ambitious for carrying out whatever is necessary to make the campaign successful, to take the case and to take it out to prospects. Which leads me to the third thing that is essential: is a sufficient number of prospects who have affinity for the organization and an affinity for that project that the organization wants to pursue. And then an additional thing about the prospects are you need to have a sufficient number with the capacity to be able to.
Affinity is one thing, but capacity is another. And generally with the capital campaign, we're not looking for $50 gifts, right?
No. And then so just to continue on and to address the types of gifts that are going to be necessary. The fourth thing an organization needs is a plan, and a plan to put the case in front of the prospects, and that happens through leaders. So, but and a key thing about a plan is, and one of the first things that you would do in a plan is create a gift chart or a gift pyramid that illustrates for you the types of gifts that you're going to need and the number of gifts that you're going to need in various areas, all of which are big gifts. By big, obviously it depends on the size of the campaign, but gifts that are going to be 25, 50,000, and up. But usually they're going to be, for a campaign of, let's say, 3 million, you're going to need, potentially $1 million gift to make that campaign successful.
Right. Can I add one more thing to your list, Scott? Is because I see it a lot too when we're talking to nonprofit leaders out there. If you want to raise $10 million for a capital campaign or $20 million, you will have to invest some resources into raising that money. It was almost certainly not going to happen by spending the exact same amount of time and money on as you currently are in raising money. There's going to have to be some investment. And sometimes it seems to surprise people that, hey, in order to do this, you're going to have to spend more time and money.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. There's an intensity to a campaign that is unlike an organization's normal annual fundraising. The goals are bigger. Usually it's time sensitive. The stakes are just higher, and the tone and the tempo of a campaign is challenging.
Yeah. Very good. Well, hey, thanks, Scott. That's good wisdom. Appreciate it.
Great. Good to be on this podcast with you, Jeremy. Take care.
All right, we are back with Brad Wilcox, Senior Fellow at the Institute for Family Studies, Director of the National Marriage Project at the University of Virginia, and Professor of Sociology at the University of Virginia, talking about marriage and family. And now I want to talk a little bit, Brad, if we can, about not the goods that marriage necessarily confers on those who are its participants, the husband and wife, but on others. Children, we've talked about a little bit and can talk about more, but I'm really interested in what your research shows about the health of communities that have higher marriage rates, let's say, civic participation, that sort of thing, volunteering, giving. Have you done research kind of on that connection between marriage and family life and those sorts of variables, and what do we know?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think people don't always recognize that sort of what happens in their own homes doesn't just affect them and their kids, but their neighborhoods and their communities. And there are a ton of different ways in which this plays out. So Raj Chetty at Harvard, an economist, has been studying social mobility in America for about a decade now with his colleagues. And he finds, for instance, that sort of the top predictor of mobility, of sort of rags to riches mobility for poor kids, in a community is the share of single parent families in that community. So what that means is that kids who are growing up in areas like Salt Lake City, who are poor at the 20th percentile, are much more likely to make it to the upper class as 30-somethings than kids who are growing up in Atlanta, poor. And that's because, in part, there are many more single-parent families in the Atlanta metro area than there are in the Salt Lake City metro area. So that's just kind of one example of the way in which, families affect our communities. Now, when it comes to public safety, very similar story. Incarceration is much higher for kids who've been raised in neighborhoods with more single-parent families, absent fathers, absent men in those communities. And that's net of controls for things like poverty and race. So this is like a unique effect of family structure on the safety of your neighborhoods and your communities. We also see when it comes to volunteering and civic engagement that certainly married parents are more likely to vote. And there's work done by this, on this by Nick Wolfinger, my colleague at the University of Utah. And they're also more likely to be involved in certain types of volunteering, obviously things like, Boy Scouts, youth soccer, et cetera. Although it does depend in terms of some of there are some forms of sort of civic engagement or neighborliness where people who are unmarried are more engaged, in part because they don't have a spouse, they don't have kids at home, and so they have more freedom, or more free time for certain kinds of activities, like going to the art museums, for instance. So you have to be careful to kind of differentiate. I mean, there's certain kinds of volunteering where married people are much more involved. I mean, religious stuff, for instance, as well. But there are other kinds of sort of civic engagement and volunteering where people who are unmarried are more likely to be, for instance, as I said, like being involved with, the arts, for instance. You'd see unmarried folks doing that more. So the story is a bit nuanced in that way.
It's interesting to me that organizations that are working on these sorts of issues and who often pride themselves on trying to get at systemic change and at the root causes of these issues don't often bring up marriage in their communities and marriage rates and things like that as one of the things they ought to be concerned about changing. It's sort of a base thing that affects what they're doing.
Yeah, I mean, it's striking, obviously, and what we do see, right, is that there's been a huge surge in interest in social justice, even the last, obviously 7 months or so, but over the last decade as well. And this has been particularly true for white, well-educated Americans. And, the striking thing, we did a report on California not too long ago called State of Contradiction. And what we showed in California is that, college-educated Californians have more progressive views on family issues. They're the most likely folks, for instance, to endorse and embrace family diversity. So that's their kind of public posture. When it comes to kind of their own practice, even their own views, they were actually also the most likely to want to have their own kids in marriage. And they were the most likely Californians to be stably married with kids. So there is this tension where I think, many college-educated Americans have a kind of prudential appreciation, pragmatic appreciation for marriage, which they act on. But in terms of their public philosophy, especially, they're not able to or willing to sort of,
endorse the same sort of, what they have done for others.
Exactly.
Right.
So, I was talking to a dean at UVA here, for instance, and he was sort of kind of congratulating me discreetly about the work I do at the National Marriage Project here at UVA. But he would never say anything in public about this topic. And the same thing with like public school superintendents and people who are like admirable people, like living good lives, great families, clearly recognize the importance at many levels of stable families. But they just don't feel like they can speak publicly on family issues and marriage in particular because, our culture has moved publicly anyways, in a very obviously progressive direction where kind of every sort of movement on the family front is seen as a sign of progress, and to raise any questions about any family developments in the last half century is to be seen as a kind of troglodyte, a kind of, right-wing person with no sense of compassion or tolerance or enlightenment. So that's sort of, we're in a predicament in that regard to cohabitation. And so it's no accident that, cohabitation is much, much less stable than marriage for families.
And doesn't confer nearly the same sorts of benefits you've been talking about throughout this interview.
Exactly. I think, people just they haven't sort of thought through all the ways in which marriage is still institutionalized and cohabitation is not. Even one more example here is if I was ever to forget my anniversary date, I would be in, huge hot water with my wife.
Right.
But if you ask,
that happens, by the way, some of us.
But if you ask a cohabiting couple, what's their anniversary date for when they began cohabiting, you often will find that each partner has a different date in their head, or they may have no date in their head. So they just kind of gradually merge over time. So just take an example again of how, these things are not, they're not the same.
They're not the same. Brad, what's happening to men in our society? What the heck happened? Why this sort of failure to launch, failure to adult, as the kids say, this sort of dysfunction and unhappiness? What are you seeing among men sociologically, and what happened over the last generation?
Yeah, so we are seeing a lot of young men today struggling in high school, struggling in college, struggling in the labor force. It's definitely one of these perfect storms, when it comes to the diagnosis here. So, one of the things that was noted by the Berkeley economist who won a Nobel Prize, and I'm totally spacing on his name. His wife is Janet Yellen, is the new Treasury Secretary, George Akerlof, is that in the late 1960s and 1970s, in the wake of the sexual revolution, the sort of expectation that young men would get married in their early 20s just kind of disappeared. That was fine for some guys. Guys who were, strong kind of clear sense of their future, who were really well motivated, who were doing well in school, they did, and they do fine today, right? But for a whole kind of class of ordinary guys and guys who were less sort of motivated, the absence of kind of marriage, the absence of having marriage on the horizon, I think, has sapped their motivation to really excel in either school or in work, in their late teens and early 20s. I think that's so. Part of it is a kind of a family shift that Akerlof talks about. He talks about how marriage basically civilizes guys. And so that's I think part of the story. Another part of the story, of course, is our schools have, I think, really catered more towards girls' styles of learning, and the kind of intense, competitive, and even obviously single-sex approaches that obtained in an earlier era are pretty infrequent today. And so I think just sort of the style of schooling today is not as conducive towards making boys interested. I also think, too, we haven't done enough to do kind of strong vocational tracks, that are more appealing to some kinds of boys as well. So there's that. I think,
by the way, I think I saw, you can tell me if this is right, maybe. I think I saw that both Black women and Asian women are now enrolled in college at higher rates than white men. This would speak to the
there may. I can't remember. Yeah, I think that's correct. I think you'd also have to differentiate between four-year colleges, I think that figure comes to mind. I think probably one of the guys at AI put that out. Yeah. Carpe diem, I think. But so then I think the two other things that I would say is that we've deinstitutionalized masculinity. We don't have a clear model for our teenage boys and young men, so they don't really know what's expected. How they can kind of meet the bar, what to do, et cetera. And the final thing that I would say is the quality of our electronic entertainments and distractions today is just astonishingly good. And it's going to get even better with virtual reality coming online. Yeah. So I think a lot of teenage boys they step into an electronic world in the afternoon. They get home from school or on the weekends, and they just kind of never really emerge. And then, they can take that pattern, into young adulthood in ways that are destructive.
Is there any society, nation on Earth where birth rates are not decreasing, where marriage rates are not decreasing? We don't sort of see the same trends basically we're seeing here in the United States.
That's a great question. I mean, there are certainly, ebbs and sort of minor ebbs and flows in the birth rate and the marriage rate, ripples, or, upwards. But I don't think I've seen a country really that's seen a sustained, impressive increase in marriage and fertility in recent years. I mean, I think we're really facing a global crisis in the century where, certainly in sub-Saharan Africa, fertility is still high, right? But in virtually every other part of the world, we've seen fertility come down markedly, and most countries around the world are below replacement. Again, with the exception of sub-Saharan Africa. So, it's and the marriage rates come down as well. I mean, I think we're having a fundamental crisis unfold in kind of our basic human relationships, and the countries where this is most advanced in East Asia. They're sort of like they're kind of the canary in the coal mine here. I mean, Japan, for instance, has a large number of people who will never marry, never have children, never have sex. And, so even the New York Times is writing stories about kind of the crisis of aging alone in Japan, talking about how there are, millions of older Japanese people who rarely see people, who live in apartments by themselves, who are unfortunately discovered oftentimes days, weeks, maybe even months, after they've died. There are special companies in Japan that'll go in and clean up, the remains of people who've died. I mean, it's just insane. So, that's sort of the worst case scenario in some ways, but I think it's a scenario that will be showing up at, sort of.
We're trending towards everywhere rather than trending away from anywhere.
Now, and of course, I think if anything, if the last, couple of years have taught us anything, it's to expect that, these trends, which are not sustainable, will not be sustained. So, I would anticipate that some countries or some groups will figure out a way to revive the fortunes of marriage and fertility, and they will have an extraordinary advantage, in this century if they can figure it out.
So that's a great way for us to sort of start wrapping up this discussion in the face of it's a global trends, a global crisis with respect to marriage rates. Anyway, if not, it's good. The good news is not divorce, but certainly marriage rates and things like birth rates. If you're a giver, what would you recommend? Like, what are the key levers that givers should be attending to in making their giving decisions if they're interested in strengthening marriage and family? Do you have ideas on that?
I think there are certainly initiatives and efforts out there to strengthen family life. I would certainly mention my own Institute for Family Studies at sort of the intellectual level, but there are groups like Communio out there right now that are working with churches and nonprofits in communities across the U.S. to strengthen marriage. And they have a track record of bringing down divorce in Jacksonville, Florida, that they are kind of drawing on that experience to work now in other places like in Colorado and Texas and Montana. And there are also, as I said before, groups like the Dibble Institute that are providing relationship education to kids across the United States. So there are, some models here where people can kind of think about giving for, family-oriented activities. But I also would sort of expand the scope here and say that we also need, I think, many more efforts on the educational front to provide good vocational training, apprenticeships, And I mean, there are examples in Philadelphia and elsewhere of schools that are providing really good vocational education. And that's in turn, based upon research that I've seen, linked oftentimes to forming marriages and better families down the road for, a lot of young adults who wouldn't be on that college track. So I think thinking about, vocational programs as well as if they're good ones in your community, they're often under resourced, to be attentive to them too.
Far too many people are going to college. True or false?
Yes, that's definitely true.
Yeah. And so if there's one policy change that you would love to see implemented either nationally, state level, local level, whatever, is there one, maybe not a silver bullet, but like this is the thing? Maybe it's defunding academia, for instance, just to get more people onto vocational tracks and not spending time and money, and therefore, deferring marriage for much longer than need be in college. What would it be?
Well, I'm certainly a big proponent of trying to eliminate the marriage penalty. So, most of our huge means-tested programs, Medicaid, of course, being the biggest one, but things also like food stamps and the ITC end up penalizing marriage for working class families. And that's just insane. So I think, doing things like doubling the threshold for these programs for married families versus single parent families would be one way to address that. We could also move towards policies that are more universal. So the child allowance which is being sort of considered right now in Congress, is an approach that would be probably sort of rolled out as a universal policy and would not penalize marriage. And you could kind of discontinue other programs, like TANF, which is kind of welfare today, and sort of fold the funding for those other programs into like this child allowance to kind of keep things simple and universal for families across the board. But yeah, I do think to respond to your comment, I think rethinking our public funding for higher education in ways that would sort of steer more money towards apprenticeships and towards vocational education, and less towards 4-year colleges and universities would be really helpful in terms of making our society a more just and equitable society where, we spend much, much more money on 4-year colleges and universities than we do on vocational education. And so it's really, it's unfair.
It's the opposite of social justice.
Exactly. No one wants to acknowledge that because most of the people who are talking about social justice are in,
are professors at colleges and universities.
So
it's funny how that happens. Brad Wilcox, thank you so much. Where can we find you online if people want to learn more about your work?
So you can go to familystudies.org, and that's where I blog with a number of colleagues. And then also my Twitter is Wilcox NMP.
Brad Wilcox, Senior Fellow at the Institute for Family Studies, Professor of Sociology at the University of Virginia, Director of the National Marriage Project at UVA. Thank you so much for being with us. We appreciate it.
It's my pleasure, Jeremy. Thanks for having me today.